On a brutally cold morning in January 1777, a young American officer named Hugh Mercer lay gasping on a frigid field outside Princeton, New Jersey, the victim of British gunfire and multiple British bayonet wounds. Mercer would expire from his wounds after agonizing days later, never knowing that the following spring a fort would be erected in his honor, about 35 miles south. That fort, Fort Mercer, standing about 5 miles south of Philadelphia on the eastern shore of the Delaware River, and its counterpart, Fort Mifflin on the Pennsylvania side, would be the subject of concentrated British attacks in October and November of 1777, actions known as part of the Philadelphia Campaign. The reason why Fort Mercer and Fort Mifflin became the focus of the war and brought the American Revolution home to the Whitehall Farm of Gloucester County, New Jersey, which is where we're now standing, was because a British army of 15,000 men had already taken occupation of Philadelphia. That army needed to be supplied by British ships down the Delaware River, and squarely between the two stood Fort Mercer, Fort Mifflin, and rows of underwater obstructions known as chevaux de frise. The chevaux were long logs with sharpened iron points on them that were poised to sit below the waterline, ready to rip the bottom out of any ship that would dare to come up the river. The British Army in Philadelphia would be unable to supply itself until those obstructions were removed and the forts were neutralized. So a decision was taken in October of 1777 that Fort Mercer would be the first of these forts to be attacked. Roughly 2,000 Hessians in the British service, German troops, more or less conscripted or sold by their rulers into British service, would be used to reduce Fort Mercer. And all of this set the stage for a battle at the fort that had been named for General Hugh Mercer. Fort Mercer that we see today is very different from its appearance in the Revolutionary era. In 1777, this fort would have extended behind the camera another 100 feet out into the river. But also, the trenches that we see around the fort, this dry moat, would have been deeper and steeper than the remnants that are visible today. Also, this side of that dry moat would have been an earthen and log wall about 8 feet tall, atop which would have been prepared positions for men to stand and also for 14 American cannon. The Americans who were inside this fort were a picked group of men in terms of being veterans of previous service in the American Revolution. They were elements of the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island Infantry, Rhode Island Continental Infantry. So these troops were about as good as any troops the Americans had in the Continental Army under George Washington at this time. They were here, though, not under Washington, but under the command of Colonel Christopher Green, who was a veteran of previous action in the American Revolution. And the Americans who served here also were unusual in that they were a very diverse force of Americans. We think that of the 500 or so Americans who were here, perhaps 50 of them were African American troops. A mixture of both free men and perhaps men who had been enslaved and escaped from their slavery. Also, there would have been a number of Narragansett Indians, Native American people from New England, who had also joined the American cause and fought here, as other Native Americans did. In terms of the force defending Fort Mercer, there would not be another American army this diverse until we get to the Korean War in the 1950s. Now, opposed to these Americans were about 2,000 conscripted men in the Hessian service. These were men whose services had been sold by their ruler to the King of England to put down the American Rebellion. But even though these men may not have joined for patriotic reasons, in fact, many of them didn't join at all, but were more or less pressed into service, they were highly trained, highly disciplined troops who were among the best troops available to the British and in the 1770s. Many of them were grenadiers who received special training and equipment for the storming of prepared objectives. Fort Mercer was an objective just like this. This position would have been not only difficult to attack because of its natural defenses, but the Americans took some steps to improve those defenses before the battle took place, knowing that Fort Mercer was a prime target. Hundreds of apple trees from the nearby Whitehall farm, in fact this is part of the Whitehall farm, were felled and placed about within musket range, about 50 to 75 yards out from the walls of the fort, with their branches intertangled and sharpened to face toward any attacking force, acting very much as a barbed wire entanglement would act today. Also, and we'll be able to get a better look at the scene of this later, but also an inner wall was placed within the fort to make a more compact and easily defensible position. So the Americans had prepared a very difficult position for the Hessians to attack, and the Hessians were going to have their hands full in attacking Fort Mercer. One of the only problems was the Hessian commander, Count Karl Emil von Donop, seems to have been overconfident and didn't realize just what a difficult position this would be to assault. Looking at the fort from its exterior gives you a perspective of what the Hessian attackers must have faced. We're standing right about where the Americans would have placed their abattis. So imagine 8-foot-high walls all along the far perimeter of the moat or the trench at Fort Mercer, and Americans atop them, firing into your massed formations as you stand here. Next to you, friends go down. Officers become casualties, some hideously wounded. Some officers taking their officer's weapon, their sponta, and trying to instantly get men back into active line so that they can keep their formation and continue the assault. At the same time, trying to hack their way through the abattis. Many of the Hessian losses would have taken place even before they penetrated inside the long rows of apple trees, the entanglement. And then the slope carpeted with dead and wounded up to the wall. This would have been one of the areas where many, many Hessians would have fallen, accounting for the large disparity in casualties between the American and Hessian sides. Hessian forces were defeated outright during the Revolution in relatively few places. The Battle of Trenton in December 1776, the Battle of Bennington in August of 1777, and here at Fort Mercer in October 1777. Between 4 and 5 p.m. on the afternoon of October 22nd, 1777, the fields and woods behind me would have seen a flag of truce, and a Hessian and British officer emerge and meet emissaries from Colonel Greene, offering them terms for the surrender of the post of Fort Mercer. The surrender was that it take place immediately, or the terms were that the surrender take place immediately. And the Americans were advised that no quarter would be given if those terms were refused. The emissary from Colonel Greene let the British spokesman and the Hessians know that no quarter would be asked and none would be given. Now, in 18th century parlance, that means there were going to be no prisoners in this battle. This was to the death. So the Americans in here and the Hessians on the other side knew that something that was as serious as it gets was about to take place. After the flag of truce session was over, the woods behind me would have exploded in the fire of hundreds of short rifles. The Hessian Jaeger Corps was taking aim at the heads of the Americans they could see popping over the walls of Fort Mercer. Following the skirmish fire to try to keep the Americans' heads down, there was a short, sharp artillery bombardment from perhaps 10 or 12 cannon, Hessian battalion guns, British mortars, or howitzers. And then, somewhere between 4:30 4:30 and 5 o'clock on that afternoon, 3 Hessian assault columns swung into action. One of them, coming from your right, would have emerged from the area near the Whitehall House. It would have come very quickly toward the American position on the south and eastern side of Fort Mercer. And then that Hessian battalion, the battalion that was named for its once Colonel von Lindsay, got hung up in the abattis. And under intense American fire, the column was broken up and forced quickly to withdraw. And then from what is the left of the camera, another Hessian assault of about 400 strength, the von Minnegerode battalion, would have scoured right along the river, their coat sleeves, one officer saying, almost along the bank of the river. And that attack would also have run into the abattis, but it would have advanced through an abandoned part of the fort. Remember, the Americans had dug or had erected an inner wall. That, unfortunately for the Hessians, that assault was brought under intense fire from 13 river galleys of the Pennsylvania Navy down in the Delaware. And that attack was shredded by American grape shot as well as fire from the cannon and muskets inside Fort Mercer. And that set the stage for the final Hessian battalion attack. The von Mirbach regiment would have come in almost directly toward the camera. It would have also stalled a bit at the abattis, but the Hessians surged over, their momentum carrying them beyond, as the American fire had to concentrate on the von Minnegerode attack along the river. The regiment von Mirbach troops spilled into an abandoned section of the fort. Many of these troops felt that they had already captured Fort Mercer because there seemed to be no Americans in their immediate vicinity. Gunsmoke hid much of what was going on until finally they realized that they were in an abandoned section of the fort as well. From an inner wall that the Americans had constructed just above the von Mirbach battalion, American fire at point-blank range decimated this Hessian assault. Now, all of this action was enormously costly on the Hessian attackers. But all of it can be told much more quickly than it took place. But everything that I've just described happened between about 4 and 5 o'clock on the afternoon of October 22nd, 1777. The battle was one of the costliest defeats that these Hessian troops suffered during the entire American Revolution. One estimate is that American gunfire from the river and the fort cut down between 350 and 400 Hessians. And the casualties were particularly significant in terms of the wounding and killing of Hessian officers. That butcher's list would have included Count von Donop, who was found out in the field that the camera is pointing toward sometime after the battle. He was severely wounded in at least one, perhaps both legs, was brought into the American lines, and eventually carried from the Whitehall House to a home across Woodbury Creek, the Joseph Lowe House, where he expired in about 3 days. American losses, given the fact that they were on the defensive, but particularly because of the protection the fort offered, were much, much lighter. Perhaps 21 wounded, 14 killed. There may have been one man missing, perhaps included among the killed or wounded. So less than 40 American casualties, and perhaps 350, 375, 400 even, for the Hessians. After the battle, the field behind me would have been carpeted with Hessian wounded and dying, many of whom were carried to the house, where they were treated, if they could be. The Hessian dead, many of them were buried in the bluff along the river, and over time, erosion has carried away their remains. So for these men from these far away German kingdoms, this would have been a place of intense suffering and melancholy. For the Americans, it was a great victory. And 52 years later, Pennsylvania and New Jersey militia commemorated that victory and commemorated the leadership of Colonel Greene, who did not survive the revolution, by erecting this marble monument to the courage and sacrifice of Colonel Greene and his men. This diverse force of Americans who stood here against some of the best troops that Europe could offer, and not only held their own, but inflicted a sharp defeat on these well-trained soldiers.